And one of the most important things in Tolkien's life was his friendship with also a famous author, C.S. Lewis. And actually, C.S. Lewis, who is well known for his books about Narnia and also defending Christianity, wasn't a Christian when they became friends. Lewis was sort of an agnostic, but when they discussed, when they started their discussions about myths and mythology, Tolkien said that the Christianity, all myths reflect the truth of Christianity, and the Christian story is a myth, but it is a true myth. And so Lewis became Christian again, partly, and I would say even mainly because of Tolkien. And they started a literary group in Oxford, where Tolkien was a professor for several decades, and this group was called the Inklings. And they gathered in a pub called the Eagle and Child, which is, I was in Oxford last year, and it's a very nice club. The pub is Eagle and Child. It's very small, and one can just imagine how they discussed and were about their works, Narnia, Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit. And they were very much the group Inklings. It was a very influential group indeed. For it was C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, and several other famous authors. But as I said, he was professor of English in the University of Leeds, and then in Oxford and professor of Oxford, Old English at Oxford from 1925 to 1925, and of English language and literature from 1945 to 1959. But the most famous scholarly work of J.R.R. Tolkien concerns the English epic, Old English epic Beowulf, and the work about Beowulf is the monsters and the critics, and in it Tolkien tells that one should criticize the story of Beowulf because it has so many monsters in it, because the monsters work as literary symbols for eternal damnation and eternal life. So they are not primitive imagery and very much essential for the functioning of the whole story of Beowulf. And the first literary success of J.R.R. Tolkien was The Hobbit, a story written for children, which tells about a person about this height, and who was a very bourgeois sort of character. But in any case, the sequel of The Hobbit is not a children's story at all. It is The Lord of the Rings, an epic story really, and it is incomprehensibly long, also 1,000 pages. But for some reason, it doesn't feel, at least to me, it doesn't feel long at all. But what Tolkien considered his main work, the Silmarillion and the prehistory of Middle-earth, he never finished it, although he would have liked to, because he was such a perfectionist, he never could get it in a perfect form. So Tolkien's son, Christopher Tolkien, edited it, and it was published after Tolkien's death in 1977. And other smaller works, mostly not part of the story of Middle-earth, were published during his lifetime. They were mostly like children's stories. For instance, a story called Mr. Bliss about a crazy man who takes a car and smashes it everywhere and meets bears and so on. And there's also an animal who is half giraffe and half rabbit and who is blind. So it is a very crazy story. But I recommend Mr. Bliss because it gives us a very different aspect of Tolkien. And in any case, the works of Tolkien about Middle-earth, there were not that many published during his lifetime, but all of his most of his unpublished works have been published in this series called History of Middle-earth. It's a 12-book series compiled by Christopher Tolkien, Tolkien's son, and it has everything about Tolkien. And also, he has recently, Christopher Tolkien, published books such as Children of Odin, which is about a longer version of a tale in Silmarillion. But Tolkien really became famous in the 60s, and it was very surprising for Tolkien because the people who liked him were actually mostly hippies, and it was Tolkien was much annoyed by some of his fans. Some of his fans called him in the middle of the night, "Oh, I want to talk to you," and Tolkien was very rude and slammed the phone down. Because they know very little about how conservative and Catholic he in fact was. And they spoke something in their pipes which Tolkien would never have. And the reason why he was loved by all people of all sorts of faiths was the quality of his works and the values embedded in the story and the psychological arc of the characters. So even though people had many sorts of faiths, Tolkien never preached in his works explicitly, so it could be enjoyed by any person at all. But if I tell you something a little or more about what sort of a person Tolkien was, he rode a bicycle to his work, and he had all the regalia on him, the black cape and everything, and he was an incredible appearance in Oxford when he rode the bicycle, because he wouldn't use a car, because when he had a car, I think he had a car twice, and he smashed both of them. Yes. So, and he was 5 foot 8 and 5 foot and 8.5 inches long, 174 centimeters, and he went to mass every day. And he refused, when they changed the Roman Catholic Mass from Latin into English, he refused to sing it in English. And Tolkien's grandson, Simon Tolkien, was very much embarrassed by the fact that Tolkien always replied very loudly in Latin every day. And that's about enough about Tolkien himself as a person. And here I am at Tolkien's grave last year in Oxford, and there is buried both Tolkien himself and his wife Edith Tolkien. And you can see here that here's Edith Mary Tolkien, and it says Luthien, and one cannot see that under John Ronald Reuel Tolkien it says Beren, and this Beren and Luthien, as I said, were the sort of the Romeo and Juliet of Tolkien's works. So it was a very influential love for him. And now we move on to describe the nature of the legendarium, the mythological stories of J.R.R. Tolkien. And as I said, it is a historical fiction set in our world. It is mythological, but it is intended. The intention is that it took place in the same world as we are. So it is not a different planet or universe, just our world in a fictional prehistory. And most of the stories are set in Middle Earth, which is in fact an old Germanic term for this world of ours between heaven and hell, or an alternative interpretation, it is that Middle Earth is between the seas. So Middle Earth in fact means Europe or Eurasia. And even though the maps don't exactly fit, which Tolkien himself knew very much, but here is a map that compares. I don't know if you can see Europe in the background a bit. So here's Middle Earth and Europe compared. So you can see that the Shire where the Hobbits live is, according to Tolkien, it would be approximately like in England, and that would make Mordor like somewhere in Bulgaria. And actually the Alps fit quite nicely with some of these mountain ranges. And Finland is over there somewhere in the very north, nobody cares. And the stories of Tolkien are very comprehensive. He tells the sort of story from the very beginning of the world up until the Lord of the Rings, and a bit after that also. But then it starts to dissolve into our history, and it is left quite vague in the sort of the gap between real history and Tolkien's fictional prehistory. But of the works of the Tolkien, the Silmarillion is sort of the Old Testament, because it is a very it is a story that is not in fact a novel, but a story that is told very like a history book. But the Lord of the Rings can be said that it's like somewhat like the New Testament.